How are you guys doing? Today is Monday, November 29th, 2021. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an elite individual profile for Stefon Diggs. The elite wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills turns 28 today, and my intention with this episode is, of course, to shine light on his accolades and achievements, not to mention his stats and numbers, as he was able to make it all the way through Maryland to the NFL, where he was one of the best players for the Minnesota Vikings, found his way on the Buffalo Bills, where he ascended to assert himself as one of the best wide receivers in all of the NFL. And, of course, he's had some amazing plays and, of course, amazing seasons along the way to get to where he is right now. So, of course, if you're not familiar with Stefon Diggs, he stands at about 6 foot, 190 pounds, which is on a little bit of the shorter end in terms of like the bigger possession wide receivers. But, of course, Stefon Diggs has incredible ability to create separation and catch the ball. And considering he's in his he's just turned 28 right now, that would insist that he's definitely at his peak. He's definitely at the height of his powers, and while doing so, he is proving to be a nuisance for cornerbacks everywhere. And I know that most defenses have to game plan against him, especially as long as he has an elite quarterback and Josh Allen throwing the ball to him. So just to get into the background of it, he's originally from Alexandria, Virginia, born in Alexandria, Virginia. He would find himself going to high school in Maryland, and he would end up staying within the state. He would go on and play, or I guess when Stefon Diggs went to Maryland, he would go on and play 3 seasons. And these seasons were under Coach Randy Edsall. And his last season was Edsel's last season. This was when Mike Locksley took over for the second half of the season. Stefon Diggs' freshman year would, of course, be his age 19 season in 2012, as he went to go on to play 11 games for a Maryland team that ended up going 4-8 for the season. They failed to make a bowl this year, but specifically in that season, Stefon Diggs would finish with 54 receptions for 848 yards and 6 touchdowns in those 11 games. And he would also go on to finish with 100 rushing yards on the season. So he finished with 962 total yards of offense. Following that freshman season, that of course would lead to his sophomore season in 2013. He would only play 7 seasons in a year where he had suffered a season-ending injury against Wake Forest. But in the 7 games he did play as a sophomore, he finished with 34 receptions for 587 yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. He also had 45 rushing yards on the ground, so he had 632 yards in 7 games, almost averaging 100 yards per game, averaging over 90 definitely. And then, of course, following that 2013 season, the Maryland Terrapins would finish with a 7-6 record. They would land in the Military Bowl, where they would lose by 11 to Marshall. And, of course, this would lead to Randy Edsall's final full season at Maryland, where Stefon Diggs would, of course, play his junior year in his last year of eligibility. He would go on and finish the season playing 10 games for a Maryland squad. They ended up going 7-6. They made the Foster Farms Bowl this year in that bowl, they ended up losing to Stanford by about 4 touchdowns. But in that season, Stefon Diggs had 62 receptions for 792 yards and 5 touchdowns. He had more receptions than his freshman year, but his freshman year, he still had the most yards and receiving touchdowns that he'd have in a year. Following that 2014 season, Stefon Diggs was effectively named to the second team All Big Ten, and he would go on to be taken with the 5th overall pick, or with the 146th overall pick in the 5th round of the 2015 NFL draft. And of course, just for a little bit of reference, the first wide receiver taken in that draft was Amari Cooper, who was taken by the Oakland Raiders, who's now the elite wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys right now, just to get a sense of how long ago that was. Following his draft, or I guess He was drafted to play with the Minnesota Vikings, and his very first season with Minnesota would be his age 22 season in 2015. And in his rookie season, Stefon Diggs would start 9 of the 13 games he played, in a season where the Minnesota Vikings would win the NFC North and finish with an 11-5 record. They won 4 more games than their previous season without him, and this was the second year that Mike Zimmer was the coach. Stefon Diggs finished with 52 receptions for 720 yards, and he had 4 receiving touchdowns on the year. And of course, following that season, Stefon Diggs would go on to make the all-rookie team. And after that, he actually wasn't named to any of the NFL teams until the 2020 NFL season. But regardless, following that season, the Minnesota Vikings would make it to the playoffs. They would lose in the wild card round to the Seahawks. And of course, just for reference, this was the year where Carolina ended up going to the Super Bowl before they ended up losing to the Denver Broncos. But of course, following that, his rookie season, he would come back for a second year in Minnesota. And in his age 23 season, Stefon Diggs would start 11 of the 13 games he played. In a season where the Minnesota Vikings finished with an 8-8 record, they won 3 less games than the previous year, and they had missed the playoffs. Stefon Diggs, while seeing himself playing the same amount of games but starting 2 more, he would see himself finishing with 32 more receptions the prior year. He had 84 receptions. He had 903 yards, which at that point was a career high. Finished with 3 receiving touchdowns at the conclusion of the season. And then, of course, this was the year where he fully earned his way into the starting spot. And in his 3rd season in Minneapolis, his age 24 season in 2007, he was a full-time starter. He would go on to start all 14 of the games he played in a season where the Minnesota Vikings finished with a 13-3 record, and they would go on to win the NFC North and effectively make the playoffs. In that season, Stefon Diggs would finish with 64 receptions, 20 less than he did the previous year. He finished with 849 yards, which is just over 54 less yards than what he did the year before. However, he would score 8 touchdowns. That season, he would go on to set at that point it was his career high in touchdowns on the year. Once the Minnesota Vikings ended up making the playoffs, they would end up beating the Saints 29-24 off of the miracle play where Stefon Diggs would end up taking the ball and scoring a 61-yard touchdown, I believe. It is forever known as the Minneapolis Miracle. And following that season, Stefon Diggs was recognized by his peers as one of the best players in football, but he still had yet to be recognized by those who deem it be in the NFL. But regardless, following that game in which they beat the Saints, the Vikings would end up losing 38-7 in the conference championship. And this is the year that the Eagles, after beating the Vikings, would go on to beat the Patriots in Minneapolis for the Super Bowl. So, of course, that stung a little hard. But regardless, following his 3rd season, Stefon Diggs would return to Minnesota for his age 25 season, his 4th season with the team. He would start 14 of the 15 games he played in a season where the Vikings finished with an 8-7-1 record, missing the playoffs again. Stefon Diggs this year would cross the 100 receptions threshold for the very first time in his career, as he finished with 1,021 yards. First time he ever finished with 1,000 yards as well. He also set a career high in touchdowns. He finished with 9 touchdowns, and even to this day, he has not scored more touchdowns than he has in 2018, And then he also finished with 62 yards on the ground. Following that season, the Minnesota Vikings did not make the playoffs. And then following that, this would lead to Stefon Diggs' final season in Minnesota. His 5th season, his age 26 season with the club in 2019. And in that season, he would start all 15 of the games he played for a Minnesota Vikings team that finished with a 10-6 record. They finished 2nd in the NFC North, but still were able to make the playoffs anyway. In that season, Stefon Diggs would start all 15 of the games he played. And like I said, he would go on to finish with 63 receptions, which is 40 less than he had the year before. But he had 1,130 receiving yards, which is the most receiving yards that he's ever recorded in Minnesota. He finished with 6 receptions as well. And then once the Vikings went to the playoffs in the 2019 season, they would end up beating the Saints in overtime in the wild card round again. This time it was actually at the Super Bowl or the Superdome, and then the Minnesota Vikings ended up losing 27-10 to the San Francisco 49ers. And ever since then, the Minnesota Vikings have not played in a playoff game. But I guess since January 2020 wasn't that long ago. But still, Stefon Diggs was a very big part of the reason why that Minnesota Vikings team was able to make it so far. And following his 5 seasons in Minnesota, Stefon Diggs would find himself getting traded to the Buffalo Bills for a draft pick that ended up being Justin Jefferson, which ended up working out incredibly well for them, and a couple of other picks. And Stefon Diggs has been a member of the Buffalo Bills since. He's been on the team. He's been on the team for a season and a half. The season is currently the half, as we are still in the midst of his second year. But looking back at his first year in Buffalo in 2020, but just to give a little bit of context, the 2020 season was impacted by COVID in the sense that fans weren't there, but they still played all 16 games. And following that looking at the 2020 season itself, Stefon Diggs would start 15 of the 16 games he played for a Buffalo Bills team. That would finish with a 13-3 record, winning the AFC East for the first time since 1995, winning 13 games in a season for the first time since 1991. That was the second year out of 4 when they went to the Super Bowl 4 years in a row. And looking at how Stefon Diggs fared in his very first season in Buffalo, he would not only be named to the Pro Bowl for the very first time in his NFL career, he also would be a first-team All-Pro at the wide receiver, either establishing himself as the best or the second best wide receiver in all of football. As throughout the entire year, for these 16 games he played, he would go on to lead the NFL in receptions. That's the only time he's ever done so in his career. He finished with 127 receptions, which is 25 more than he did the 2 years prior. But that's the second time he's had 100 receptions. He would finish with 1,535 receptions. This would be the NFL lead again. He would be the NFL leader in receptions and receiving yards. This is the third year in a row he finished with at least 1,000 receiving yards. He finished with 8 receiving touchdowns. This would be the third year of the last 4 he's finished with at least 8. He has not finished with at least 8 since 2020, or I guess since that was the last full year he played. Not to mention that at the conclusion of the season, the Buffalo Bills did have playoff games to play. They did beat the Indianapolis Colts in the first round by 3 before beating the Ravens by 2 touchdowns in the divisional round. And then the Bills ended up losing in the AFC Championship to the Chiefs, who ended up losing to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And that was the most recent Super Bowl played to date. And of course, following that 2020 season, many regarded Stefon Diggs as one of the best wide receivers in football now that he had Josh Allen throwing the ball to him. And of course, this currently leads us to where we are now, as Stefon Diggs is currently playing for as of right now, Stefon Diggs is currently playing for a Buffalo Bills team that at the moment is doing pretty well for themselves. They came off of a 31-6 Thanksgiving win. Stefon Diggs himself actually had 7 receptions, 74 yards, and a touchdown, as he is working to earn yet another Pro Bowl, as we are halfway through a season in which the Bills look like they can win their division, and they definitely have a stake in the playoffs this year. But one thing is definitely known, and is that Stefon Diggs is one of the best wide receivers in football. And with that said, I can't wait to see what he does continuing forward, and hopefully by this time next year I'll have more to say. I want to thank the Football Reference websites, and of course ESPN, NFL.com, and every other website that I used in order to put this episode together. I want to thank everybody for listening to all 14 minutes of this episode. I really do hope all is well. And if you ever get a chance to watch Stefon Diggs, I would. He's wearing number 14 for the Buffalo Bills, and he is Josh Allen's favorite target. Definitely for this year, and hopefully for many more years to come. With that said, I want to thank everyone once again for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and I'll catch you with more tomorrow. Peace out.